There was once a young man who stood at a fork in the road. To his right lay a smooth, paved path that stretched out before him, clear and inviting. To his left, a rugged trail climbed steeply upward, littered with stones and bordered by thorns. The paved road promised comfort and ease. The rugged path promised nothing but challenge. Which would you choose? Before you answer, let me tell you what happened to this young man. He chose the paved road. Of course he did. Who wouldn't? It was the logical choice, the sensible choice. And for a time he walked with a spring in his step, making good progress with minimal effort. But as the years passed, something strange happened. The man found himself growing restless, then discontented, and finally deeply unhappy. Though he had traveled far along his smooth road, he realized one day that he had gone nowhere at all. Meanwhile, from his vantage point, he could see others who had chosen the harder path. They moved slowly, sometimes stumbling, sometimes stopping altogether to nurse their wounds. But they were climbing, and from their height, they saw vistas he could not even imagine. This is the truth I want to share with you today. The harder path wins. Not sometimes, not often, always. I want you to feel this truth in your bones, because it runs counter to everything our comfort-seeking nature desires. We are wired to avoid pain, to minimize effort, to seek the path of least resistance. And yet the greatest achievements, the deepest fulfillments, the most profound transformations always come from choosing the harder path. Look at your own life. Think of your proudest moments, your greatest accomplishments. Did they come easily? Or did they demand everything you had to give? I can answer that for you without knowing the details. They demanded everything. That's why they matter to you. The universe operates on principles, unchangeable laws that govern all of creation. One of these laws is particularly relevant to our discussion today. Nothing of value comes without cost. Nothing. The degree of value is directly proportional to the difficulty of attainment. Consider the diamond. What makes it so precious? Its beauty, certainly. But stones of equal beauty sell for far less. What sets the diamond apart is its rarity and the extraordinary conditions required for its creation. Diamonds form under extreme pressure deep within the earth over periods of time we can scarcely comprehend. The harder path of creation gives them their value. Or consider the oak tree. From a tiny acorn comes a mighty giant that can stand for centuries. But this transformation requires the acorn to be buried in darkness, to crack open and lose its identity, to push against the weight of soil, to weather storms and droughts and countless challenges. The mighty oak exists because it took the harder path. You are no different. Your greatest potential, the person you are capable of becoming, waits for you on the harder path. Not the path of comfort or convenience, but the path of resistance, challenge, and sometimes pain. But here is the beautiful paradox. The harder path, while difficult in the moment, leads to the easier life. The easier path, while comfortable in the moment, leads to the harder life. Let me say that again, because this principle alone can transform your existence. The harder path leads to the easier life. The easier path leads to the harder life. The man who chooses the harder path of discipline in his youth enjoys the easier path of freedom in his age. The woman who chooses the harder path of saying no to immediate pleasures enjoys the easier path of achievement and fulfillment over time. The individual who chooses the harder path of confronting their weaknesses enjoys the easier path of authentic confidence and capability. Conversely, the one who chooses the easier path of avoiding challenges finds themselves on the harder path of regret and limitation. The one who chooses the easier path of procrastination finds themselves on the harder path of last-minute panic and mediocre results. The one who chooses the easier path of blaming others finds themselves on the harder path of perpetual victimhood. Which path are you on right now? Be honest with yourself. Are you choosing what's easy in the moment or what's right for your future? There's a story about a professor who began each semester by holding up a glass of water and asking his students how heavy it was. After fielding several guesses, he would explain, "The absolute weight doesn't matter. What matters is how long I hold it. If I hold it for a minute, no problem. If I hold it for an hour, my arm will ache. If I hold it for a day, my arm will feel paralyzed. The weight doesn't change, but the longer I hold it, the heavier it becomes." Then he would make his real point. Life's challenges and burdens are like this glass of water. Hold them for a short time and they're manageable. Hold them for too long and they become unbearable. The solution isn't to avoid the weight, it's to put it down regularly. The harder path isn't about constant strain, it's about knowing when to push and when to rest. It's about strategic difficulty, chosen challenge, purposeful resistance. It's about becoming stronger through voluntary hardship rather than becoming weaker through voluntary ease. No one gets stronger by avoiding resistance. Muscles grow when they are challenged beyond their comfort zone, when they are torn down so they can rebuild stronger than before. The mind and spirit operate on the same principle. They grow through challenge, not through comfort. This principle explains why so many people who inherit great wealth or sudden fame find themselves miserable. They've been given the destination without walking the path. They've received the reward without earning the strength that makes the reward meaningful. The harder path isn't just about the external achievement. It's about who you become in the process of walking it. I want you to take a moment right now and ask yourself, what harder path am I avoiding? What challenge am I sidestepping that I know deep down I need to face? Perhaps it's a difficult conversation you need to have. Perhaps it's a skill you need to develop. Perhaps it's a habit you need to break, or a truth you need to confront. Whatever it is, I want you to name it, silently, to yourself. Name the harder path you've been avoiding. Now consider this. That harder path hasn't gone away by being avoided. If anything, it's grown more formidable in your absence. The longer you wait to walk it, the more intimidating it becomes. The weeds grow higher, the incline gets steeper, the resistance builds. There's a profound difference between putting off pain and eliminating it. Most of what we call procrastination is simply the postponement of pain, not its removal. And postponed pain compounds like a high-interest debt. The man who avoids the harder path of addressing his health in his 30s faces the much harder path of chronic illness in his 50s. The woman who avoids the harder path of financial discipline in her youth faces the much harder path of financial insecurity in her later years. The professional who avoids the harder path of continuous learning faces the much harder path of obsolescence and irrelevance. The harder path wins because it aligns with reality. It acknowledges the true nature of achievement and growth. It respects the universal law that meaningful rewards require meaningful investment. Consider the craftsman who spends decades perfecting his skill. Each day, he faces the harder path of deliberate practice, of confronting his limitations, of starting over when a piece doesn't meet his standards. A lesser individual might take shortcuts, might settle for good enough, might prioritize quantity over quality. But the master craftsman knows better. He knows that the harder path of excellence leads to the creation of work that endures, that inspires, that commands respect. He knows that the easier path of mediocrity leads to work that is forgotten, that fails to move others, that ultimately brings no lasting satisfaction to its creator. Or consider the parent who faces the harder path of consistent discipline and boundaries with their child. How much easier it would be to give in, to avoid the tantrums, to be the fun parent who never says no. But the wise parent understands that the harder path of appropriate discipline leads to the development of a child with self-control, respect for others, and the ability to delay gratification qualities that will serve them throughout life. The parent who chooses the easier path in the moment creates a harder path for both themselves and their child in the future. The parent who chooses the harder path in the moment creates an easier path for both. This principle extends to every area of life. The harder path of truthfulness leads to the easier path of clear conscience and authentic relationships. The harder path of forgiveness leads to the easier path of freedom from bitterness and resentment. The harder path of continuous learning leads to the easier path of opportunity and adaptability. I want to be very clear. Choosing the harder path doesn't mean making life unnecessarily difficult. It doesn't mean suffering for the sake of suffering. It means refusing to avoid necessary challenges. It means embracing productive discomfort. It means doing what's difficult now to prevent what would be more difficult later. There's a powerful story about two farmers. Both owned adjacent fields. Both faced the same weather, the same soil conditions, the same market demands. But they approached their work very differently. The first farmer took the easier path at every opportunity. He planted his crops without properly preparing the soil. He addressed weeds reactively rather than preventatively. He invested minimally in irrigation. When equipment broke down, he made temporary fixes rather than proper repairs. The second farmer consistently chose the harder path. He spent weeks preparing his soil before planting a single seed. He established systems to prevent weeds rather than just responding to them. He invested heavily in proper irrigation. When equipment showed signs of wear, he performed thorough maintenance rather than waiting for breakdowns. For the first growing season, the first farmer seemed to be ahead. He spent less time in his fields, less money on his operation, and appeared to have an easier life. The second farmer worked longer hours, invested more resources, and faced daily challenges head-on. But as the years passed, their situations reversed dramatically. The first farmer's soil became depleted, his equipment unreliable, his crop yields diminishing. The second farmer's soil grew richer, his equipment more efficient, his crop yields increasing. What had begun as the harder path had become the easier life. What had begun as the easier path had become the harder life. This pattern repeats itself throughout history and across every domain of human endeavor. The individual, organization, or society that chooses immediate comfort over necessary challenge inevitably faces greater challenges in the future. The one that embraces necessary challenge in the present creates greater comfort for the future. Consider education. The student who takes the harder path of deep engagement with material, who wrestles with difficult concepts rather than memorizing just enough to pass the test, who seeks out challenging courses rather than easy grades. This student initially works harder than peers who take the path of minimal effort. But over time, the deeply educated student develops learning capabilities, thinking habits, and knowledge frameworks that make continued learning easier. What begins as the harder path leads to the easier acquisition of new skills and adaptation to new circumstances. Meanwhile, the student who consistently takes the easier path finds learning increasingly difficult as knowledge gaps widen and foundational weaknesses compound. What begins as the easier path leads to the harder experience of being perpetually behind, perpetually confused, perpetually limited. I want to ask you a question that may be uncomfortable. In what area of your life are you choosing the easier path today at the expense of your tomorrow? Where are you borrowing from your future self to pay for present comfort? This isn't about self-flagellation or unnecessary hardship. It's about honest assessment and strategic choice. It's about understanding that the harder path isn't something to be avoided. It's something to be embraced as the very route to your greatest achievements and deepest satisfactions. Think about the times in your life when you've chosen the harder path. Perhaps you stayed up late studying while others partied. Perhaps you saved money while others spent freely. Perhaps you faced a difficult truth while others lived in comfortable denial. Perhaps you put in extra hours developing a skill while others were content with mediocrity. How do you feel about those choices now? Do you regret them? Or are they the very choices that have given your life meaning and opened doors of opportunity? I've never met someone who regretted taking the harder path of discipline, growth, integrity, or excellence. I've met countless people who regretted taking the easier path of comfort, stagnation, compromise, or mediocrity. The harder path has a mysterious quality. It gets easier as you walk it. What seems impossibly difficult on day 1 becomes manageable by day 30, and second nature by day 100. The weights that once felt unbearably heavy become your warm-up as your strength increases. The problems that once seemed insurmountable become routine as your capabilities expand. Conversely, the easier path has a tragic quality. It gets harder as you walk it. What seems comfortably easy on day 1 becomes problematic by day 30 and potentially disastrous by day 100. The basic physical activities that once felt effortless become challenging as your fitness decreases. The minor financial pressures that once seemed manageable become overwhelming as your resources diminish. The harder path wins because it aligns with how humans actually grow and develop. We are anti-fragile beings. We get stronger through appropriate stress. Remove all stress, all challenge, all resistance from a human life. And you don't create paradise. You create atrophy. You create weakness. You create profound vulnerability to the inevitable challenges that life will bring. There's a fascinating phenomenon in ecological research called the Biosphere 2 experiment. Scientists built a completely enclosed, artificial environment in which trees were protected from all external stresses, including wind. Unexpectedly, these protected trees grew faster than trees in the natural environment, but they also fell over before reaching maturity. The scientists discovered that trees need the stress of wind to develop stress wood, which gives them structural integrity. Without this stress, they grow quickly but collapse under their own weight. You and I are no different. We need appropriate stress to develop our own version of stress wood. The character, capability, and resilience that allow us to stand tall through life's inevitable storms. This brings us to an important distinction. There's a crucial difference between the harder path and mere suffering. The harder path is chosen. It's strategic. It's purposeful. It's aligned with your deepest values and longest-term goals. Mere suffering is often unchosen, random, purposeless, and aligned with nothing beyond itself. I'm not advocating for suffering. I'm advocating for the voluntary acceptance of challenges that serve your highest good. I'm advocating for the willing embrace of difficulties that forge you into the person you aspire to be. Consider two individuals facing the challenge of public speaking. Both experience anxiety at the thought of addressing an audience. The first avoids public speaking whenever possible, taking the easier path of silence and safety. The second deliberately seeks opportunities to speak, taking the harder path of confronting their fear directly. Initially, the first person has an easier time. They avoid the sleepless nights, the nervous preparation, the vulnerability of standing before a critical audience. The second person endures all of these difficulties and more. But over time, their experiences diverge dramatically. The first person's fear doesn't diminish through avoidance, it grows. Their world becomes increasingly limited as they organize their life around avoiding this particular challenge. Meanwhile, the second person's fear gradually diminishes through exposure. Their capabilities expand. Their confidence grows. Their world enlarges as they become comfortable in previously intimidating situations. The harder path of facing the fear leads to the easier life of freedom and opportunity. The easier path of avoiding the fear leads to the harder life of limitation and constraint. This pattern repeats itself across contexts. The harder path of saving leads to the easier life of financial freedom. The harder path of exercise leads to the easier life of physical capability. The harder path of skill development leads to the easier life of professional opportunity. The harder path of emotional honesty leads to the easier life of authentic relationships. What harder path are you avoiding right now? What challenge are you sidestepping that might actually be the very thing you need to embrace? There's an old proverb that says, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." The same wisdom applies to the harder path. The best time to start walking it was long ago. The second best time is today. Perhaps you've been avoiding the harder path of reconnecting with an estranged family member. Perhaps you've been avoiding the harder path of addressing a health concern. Perhaps you've been avoiding the harder path of developing a crucial professional skill. Perhaps you've been avoiding the harder path of ending a relationship that no longer serves your highest good. Whatever it is, I invite you to name it, face it, and take one step along that harder path today. Not tomorrow, not when you feel more ready, not when circumstances are more favorable. Today. Because here's another truth about the harder path. It never gets easier to start. It only gets harder. The resistance you feel never decreases through avoidance. It only increases. A time when you procrastinated on an important task. Did the task become easier through procrastination? Did your resistance to it diminish? Of course not. Both the task and your resistance to it grew with every day of delay. And the harder path wins precisely because it confronts this resistance directly rather than allowing it to build. It acknowledges the universal truth that the longer you wait to do what must be done, the more difficult it becomes to do it. This brings us to another crucial aspect of the harder path. It often involves saying no to good things in order to say yes to great things. It involves sacrifice, not mean-spirited self-denial, but strategic relinquishment of lesser goods for greater goods. The Olympic athlete sacrifices countless pleasures and comforts in pursuit of excellence. The successful entrepreneur sacrifices security and leisure in pursuit of creation. The devoted parent sacrifices personal freedom in pursuit of raising healthy children. The accomplished artist sacrifices immediate recognition in pursuit of authentic expression. These sacrifices aren't punishments, they're investments, they're trades, smaller, immediate satisfactions exchanged for larger, delayed satisfactions, and they're available to all of us, in every circumstance, at every moment. We can all choose the harder path of strategic sacrifice over the easier path of indiscriminate indulgence. But here's an important qualifier. The harder path isn't about asceticism for its own sake. It's not about rejecting pleasure or embracing pain as inherent goods. It's about recognizing that the richest pleasures and the deepest satisfactions often lie on the other side of challenge, effort, and even temporary discomfort. The pleasure of reaching a mountain summit after a strenuous climb. Think about the satisfaction of mastering a difficult skill after months of practice. Think about the joy of harvest after a season of planting and tending. These pleasures are qualitatively different from and vastly superior to the fleeting pleasures of comfort and convenience. The harder path wins because it leads to these deeper satisfactions rather than mere temporary comforts. It trades shallow immediacy for profound fulfillment. There's a story about a man who watched a butterfly struggling to emerge from its chrysalis. Moved by compassion, he decided to help. He carefully cut open the chrysalis, allowing the butterfly to emerge easily. But instead of flying away, the butterfly crawled around with swollen body and shriveled wings, unable to fly. What the man didn't realize was that the struggle to emerge from the chrysalis was necessary. It forced fluid from the butterfly's body into its wings, preparing them for flight. By removing the struggle, the man inadvertently crippled the butterfly. Many of us do the same to ourselves. We avoid necessary struggles, not realizing that these very struggles are what would strengthen us for life's journey. We choose the easier path, not recognizing that it leads to the harder life of limitation and regret. The harder path wins because it honors the truth that growth happens at the edge of comfort, not within it. It acknowledges that capability expands through challenge, not through ease. It recognizes that character develops through resistance, not through indulgence. And ultimately, the harder path wins because it aligns with our deepest nature as humans. We are not made for comfort alone. We are made for challenge, for growth, for transcendence. We are happiest not when life is easiest, but when we are fully engaged in meaningful pursuits that demand our best. Ask yourself, when have you felt most alive? When have you experienced the deepest satisfaction? I doubt it was during periods of maximum comfort and minimum effort. More likely it was during periods of significant challenge, when you were stretched beyond your previous limitations, when you were fully engaged in something that mattered deeply to you. Two roads, one smooth and beckoning, promising rest for weary feet, one rough and challenging, promising nothing but difficulty. Which will you choose? Which will you choose today and tomorrow, and in all the small moments where destiny is truly determined? I began with this image because it captures the essential choice we all face. Not once, but continually. The choice between what's easy and what's right, between what's comfortable and what's necessary, between what serves the moment and what serves the future. The world tells you to choose the smooth road. Culture celebrates comfort, convenience, instantaneous results. Advertising promises paths without resistance, achievements without effort, fulfillment without sacrifice. Even well-meaning voices urge balance, moderation, self-care, in ways that sometimes mask justifications for choosing easier paths over harder ones. Against this cultural current, I've made the case that the harder path wins. Not sometimes, not often, but always. It wins not because difficulty is inherently virtuous, but because meaningful growth is inherently difficult. It wins not because sacrifice is intrinsically valuable, but because significant achievement inherently requires investment. It wins not because challenge is automatically beneficial, but because capability inevitably develops through appropriate resistance. The harder path wins because it aligns with how reality actually functions rather than how we might wish it functioned. It acknowledges that strength develops through stress, that skills emerge through practice, that character forms through testing. It recognizes that investments precede returns, that efforts precede results, that planting precedes harvesting. Most importantly, the harder path wins because, while initially more difficult, it leads to the easier life of expanded capability, authentic confidence, and meaningful achievement. Conversely, the easier path, while initially more comfortable, leads to the harder life of limited capacity, fragile self-worth, and regretted potential. The parent who takes the harder path of consistent discipline creates the easier path of mutual respect and cooperation with their child. The one who takes the easier path of inconsistent permissiveness creates the harder path of escalating conflict and diminishing influence. The professional who takes the harder path of continuous skill development creates the easier path of abundant opportunity and valuable contribution. The one who takes the easier path of minimal growth creates the harder path of decreasing relevance and limited options. The partner who takes the harder path of vulnerability and authentic communication creates the easier path of deep connection and mutual understanding. The one who takes the easier path of surface engagement creates the harder path of persistent loneliness despite proximity. The leader who takes the harder path of principled decision-making creates the easier path of consistent integrity and earned authority. The one who takes the easier path of expedient choices creates the harder path of compromised credibility and diminishing influence. Across contexts and throughout time, this pattern repeats. The harder path leads to the easier life. The easier path leads to the harder life. But here's a crucial truth we must acknowledge. The transition isn't immediate. Between choosing the harder path and experiencing its superior outcomes lies a period of difficulty without visible reward. Between choosing the easier path and experiencing its inferior outcomes lies a period of comfort without apparent consequence. This delay between choice and result, between sowing and reaping, creates the illusion that the easier path might actually be superior. When you see someone taking the easier path and appearing to thrive while you struggle on the harder path, doubt arises. When you experience the difficulty of the harder path without yet receiving its rewards, temptation grows. This is where vision becomes essential, the ability to see beyond present circumstances to future possibilities, to trust processes whose outcomes remain temporarily invisible, to maintain faith in principles when immediate evidence seems contradictory. The farmer must maintain vision during planting season when seeds disappear into soil without visible growth. The investor must maintain vision during market downturns when assets appear to lose rather than gain value. The parent must maintain vision during challenging developmental stages when corrective guidance appears to create conflict rather than character. Those who succeed on the harder path cultivate this vision. They develop the capacity to see harvests in seeds, finished works in raw materials, future capabilities in present challenges. They recognize that the correlation between current difficulty and future benefit, while not immediately apparent, is nonetheless real and reliable. This vision sustains them through what we might call the dip, the period when the harder path feels hardest, when its costs are most apparent and its benefits least visible. Every significant endeavor includes such a dip. Every meaningful pursuit involves a phase where continuation requires faith that transcends immediate evidence. Those who lack vision abandon the harder path during this dip. They interpret temporary difficulty as permanent condition rather than transitional state. They mistake the deepest part of the dip for the entire journey rather than its most challenging segment. But those who maintain vision persist. They understand that the dip, while difficult, is transitory. They recognize that persistence through this phase leads to breakthroughs that transform the experience of the harder path from heavy burden to rewarding challenge. This breakthrough often comes in the form of identity transformation. You move from doing the harder path as an external discipline to being the kind of person for whom the harder path feels increasingly natural, increasingly aligned with developing character. The athlete moves from forcing themselves to train to becoming someone who feels incomplete without training. The creator moves from making themselves right to becoming someone who needs to write. The entrepreneur moves from pushing themselves to innovate to becoming someone energized by innovation. This identity-level change represents the point where the dip begins to ascend, where investment starts generating returns, where sacrifice begins yielding rewards. It marks the transition from the hardest phase of the harder path to its most rewarding phase. But critically, this transformation occurs only through persistence during the dip. It emerges from consistent choice of the harder path especially when that path feels most difficult and least rewarding. It develops through faith-filled action that precedes evidence-based confirmation. This is why starting the harder path isn't sufficient. Many start, few persist, fewer still persist long enough to experience the identity transformation that makes the harder path sustainable and ultimately rewarding. The harder path wins, but its victory belongs only to those who continue walking it through the dip, who maintain vision when evidence seems contrary, who trust principles when circumstances appear unsupportive. You may be in such a dip right now. You've chosen the harder path in some area of life, perhaps in health, relationships, career, personal development, or creative expression. You're experiencing its difficulty without yet receiving its rewards. You're seeing others who chose easier paths appearing to thrive while you struggle. You're questioning whether the harder path actually leads where you've been promised it leads. I want to tell you, it does. The principles are sound. The pattern is reliable. The harder path does win, but only for those who continue walking it past the point where many turn back, only for those who persist through the dip, where vision becomes more important than visibility. The victory of the harder path isn't automatic. It's conditional dependent, not just on initial choice, but on sustained commitment. Not just on beginning, but on continuing. Not just on sampling, but on persisting. And this commitment becomes easier when you connect the harder path to deeper purpose. When you clarify why the destination matters, the difficulty of the journey becomes more bearable. When you articulate how the path serves your highest values, its challenges become meaningful rather than merely arduous. Ask yourself, why does this harder path matter to me? What does it connect to that transcends immediate comfort or convenience? How does it serve purposes larger than momentary pleasure or relief? Your answers to these questions fuel persistence when motivation falters. They provide energy when fatigue threatens. They offer meaning when challenges feel arbitrary or pointless. The harder path wins for those who walk it, not just with determination, but with purpose, not just with discipline, but with meaning, not just with effort, but with connection to values that transcend immediate experience. And crucially, the harder path wins for those who embrace its difficulty willingly rather than resentfully, who acknowledge its challenges as necessary rather than unfair, who accept its demands as appropriate rather than excessive. The attitude you bring to the harder path significantly influences your experience of it. When you walk it with resistance, seeing its difficulties as impositions to be endured, you experience maximum suffering with minimum benefit. When you walk it with acceptance, seeing its difficulties as investments to be embraced, you experience sustainable challenge with optimal growth. This willing acceptance doesn't make the harder path objectively easier, but it transforms its subjective difficulty from meaningless suffering to purposeful challenge. It converts resistance that depletes into engagement that energizes. It changes obligatory compliance into voluntary commitment. The harder path wins, especially for those who walk it not because they must, but because they choose to. Not because it's imposed, but because it's embraced. Not because it's the only option, but because it's the better option despite its difficulty. This willing embrace of the harder path represents wisdom, the recognition that present comfort often conflicts with future thriving, that momentary relief frequently undermines lasting satisfaction, that the path of least resistance rarely leads to destinations of greatest value. Such wisdom develops through experience, through observation of patterns, through recognition of principles that govern achievement and growth. It emerges from seeing the results of easier and harder paths played out over time, rather than judged in isolated moments. The wise individual knows that the harder path of proper nutrition leads to the easier life of health and energy, while the easier path of unrestricted consumption leads to the harder life of illness and limitation. They know that the harder path of financial discipline leads to the easier life of options and security, while the easier path of unconstrained spending leads to the harder life of stress and constraint. They know that the harder path of skill development leads to the easier life of opportunity and contribution, while the easier path of minimal growth leads to the harder life of stagnation and irrelevance. This wisdom allows them to choose the harder path not from ignorance of alternatives, but from clear-eyed assessment of outcomes. They choose difficulty now for ease later, rather than ease now for difficulty later. They invest in future thriving at the cost of present comfort, rather than sacrificing future thriving for present comfort. And over time, they experience the profound truth that the harder path, though never objectively easy, becomes subjectively easier through consistent choice. The gap between what challenges them and what they can handle narrows. The distance between what demands their best effort and what they can comfortably give decreases. The harder path remains harder than alternatives, but their capacity to walk it expands until what once seemed impossible becomes merely difficult. What was merely difficult becomes manageable. What was manageable becomes routine. This expanded capacity represents the ultimate victory of the harder path. Beyond specific achievements, beyond particular rewards, beyond distinct capabilities, the harder path develops general capacity for challenge, broad resilience against difficulty, comprehensive capability for meaningful pursuit regardless of domain. The individual who consistently chooses the harder path develops not just specific strengths, but strength itself, not just particular disciplines, but disciplined character, not just certain achievements, but achieving nature. They become not just someone who can do hard things, but someone who is defined by doing them, not just a person who occasionally rises to challenges, but a person characterized by rising to them. This transformation from doing to being, from occasional choice to defining character, represents the deepest victory of the harder path. It transcends particular outcomes to reshape identity itself. It moves beyond what you can accomplish to redefine who you are. And here's the beautiful paradox. This transformation makes the harder path feel less like hardship and more like authentic expression. What begins as discipline becomes dedication. What starts as obligation becomes opportunity. What initially feels like sacrifice becomes service to your highest self and deepest values. Two roads. One smooth and beckoning, promising rest for weary feet. One rough and challenging, promising nothing but difficulty. Which will you choose? Which will you choose not once but daily, not in dramatic moments but ordinary decisions, not when motivation runs high but when resistance seems strongest? The harder path wins, but only for those who choose it consistently, who walk it persistently, who embrace it willingly, who connect it purposefully, who trust it faithfully, who continue through the dip where many turn back, who persist to the transformation that makes temporary difficulty serve permanent development. Will you be among them? Will you choose the harder path not despite its challenges, but because of what those challenges develop in you? Will you embrace discomfort that serves growth over comfort that enables stagnation? Will you invest in future thriving at the cost of present ease? These questions aren't abstract, they're concrete choices you face today and every day. They're decisions about how you'll spend the next hour, how you'll approach your next interaction, how you'll handle your next challenge. The harder path isn't a distant journey. It's the step directly in front of you that requires more than comfortable effort, more than convenient engagement, more than customary commitment. It's the choice to do what's difficult now because it serves what matters most ultimately. I began our time together with a young man standing at a fork in the road, choosing between smooth pavement and rugged trail. That young man exists within each of us at every crossroads, every decision point, every moment of choice between what's easy and what's better. Look for those moments today. Notice the small crossroads where paths diverge slightly, where the easier option presents itself automatically, while the harder alternative requires conscious choice. Recognize that these apparently minor decisions, these seemingly insignificant choices between slightly different paths, compound over time to create vastly different destinations, dramatically different lives, fundamentally different selves. Choose the harder path, not from masochism but from wisdom, not from self-punishment but from self-respect. Not from external pressure, but from internal alignment with your highest values and deepest purpose. Choose it because it develops your best self. Choose it because it leads to your most meaningful contribution. Choose it because, though initially more difficult, it creates the life of expanded capacity, authentic achievement, and lasting fulfillment that the easier path promises but never delivers. The harder path wins. It always has. It always will. Not because difficulty is inherently virtuous, but because growth is inherently difficult. Not because challenge is automatically valuable, but because capacity inevitably develops through appropriate resistance. Not because the harder path is better in every momentary comparison, but because it's dramatically superior in cumulative result. I challenge you to choose this harder path. Not once, but consistently, not dramatically, but practically. Not someday, but today. Choose it in the next decision you face. Choose it in how you spend the next hour. Choose it in how you respond to the next challenge. Choose it in seemingly small ways that create momentum toward increasingly significant choices. Two roads. Your feet are on one of them right now. Is it the one that feels easier in this moment but leads to increasing limitation? Or is it the one that feels harder in this moment but leads to expanding capability? The choice is yours. The consequence is yours. The transformation or its absence is yours. Choose wisely, choose courageously, choose purposefully, because the harder path wins, and those who walk it win with it.